Welcome to the Chronicles of a Cheating Wife channel. A new story every day. Don't forget to subscribe. You knew I was like this. I remember how lightly she whispered that. The syllables slipped from her mouth like a stray thread unwinding from an old sweater. In the dim blue glow of the hallway nightlight, her face looked calm, almost tranquil, the way one imagines the sea before a sudden squall. I stood there, struggling to comprehend the meaning behind her words, but inside me it already churned, an undertow of doubt, fear, and something strangely akin to relief. Part of me expected this moment all along, as if I'd been bracing for a final blow that only now made itself known. I need to rewind, just slightly, because the real story begins on a school bus, or maybe not the bus itself, but that fleeting moment when I caught her singing. The same soft hum, the same lullaby of breath that used to be mine, a fragile tune she would murmur in our kitchen, swirling coffee with a spoon, or in bed, believing I was asleep, but never realizing I memorized every note. A quiet hush that always ended with her slight sigh. And there she was, repeating it for another man. That day, I was sitting 2 rows behind the driver, filling in for my son's field trip chaperone at the last minute. My wife, Caroline, had volunteered first. Mark, though I didn't know his name at the time, had this easy grin plastered on his face, that grin people wear when they're absolutely sure they own the room. Or in that case, the bus. He was talking with her, but it was the subtlety of her body language that hit me. A tilt of the head, a quiet laugh, her hair grazing his shoulder. And then, as the bus rattled along a half-empty street, she leaned closer to him and hummed. That hum, my hum, brought me back to every dawn when her breath gently tickled my ear as she sang me awake. Now the same melody, caged in the same timbre, was offered to him. Something deep inside me fractured at that instant. I wouldn't say it was an explosion. No, more like a crack in a heavy dam, letting in the first thin rivulet of suspicion. I said nothing, merely closed my eyes and listened. When we got home that evening, she acted normal, or so she believed. She slipped off her shoes in the hallway, the way she always did, and I watched the faint lines of tension in her ankles, in the arch of her foot. She tossed a casual smile over her shoulder, the same smile she'd been giving me for years, but now it felt forced. I realized I could measure the pressure behind her eyes, the small tension in the corners of her mouth. Out of old habit, I asked how it went. She answered with half shrugs and quick glances. She said they'd visited the museum. The kids had a blast, and the bus ride was uneventful. In the warm glow of our living room lamp, her hair caught a slice of yellowish light, giving her an almost angelic aura. I saw that for a fleeting second. Then I pictured her humming in Mark's ear, and everything about her face flickered like a photograph in a dying projector. After that, I became an observer. There was no confrontation, no stinging accusation, just the slow, methodical gathering of details. Maybe it started as self-preservation. Maybe I was afraid that if I confronted her, I would be the one who tore the family apart with my own voice. So I said nothing and watched. I listened, too, closely. I recorded, in my mind, the sound of her footsteps in the corridor. Left, right, always a fraction of a second out of perfect rhythm. It was like a metronome built to reveal hidden truths. For years, I believed that if I listened carefully enough, I would uncover sincerity behind every misstep. Now, I used it to detect betrayal. A single, out-of-tune beat in that daily pattern was enough to confirm my suspicions. I noticed the calls that came at odd hours. She stepped outside with her phone. Voice hushed. Half the time, she'd apologize for stepping away. The other half, she'd ignore my presence entirely. Sometimes, I glimpsed her reflection in the microwave's glass door, biting her lip in frustration or smiling faintly. One night, she decided to take a casual drive after dinner, said she needed fresh air. I wondered if she was going to meet him, but I still kept silent. Maybe I was gathering evidence, or maybe I feared losing my composure. I sat by the kitchen table, stifling a bitter laugh, remembering how she used to sing in that exact spot. The hush in the kitchen was deafening, except for the ticking of the wall clock, each second stabbing my mind like a pointed remark. Still, I said nothing. It wasn't long before more cracks appeared in our life. Our child, he was around 7 at the time, came down with a fever that refused to break. We took him to the doctor. A standard procedure, except it wasn't standard at all. Something about his blood markers made the pediatrician suggest a deeper check, a DNA test to rule out a genetic predisposition. I recall the awkward silence in the doctor's office. White walls, fluorescent lights flickering like an interrogation lamp. And from that test, the truth arrived like a bullet train. I wasn't the father. It didn't matter that I'd bandaged skinned knees, or taught him how to hold a fishing rod, or read him bedtime stories about dragons and pirates. No matter how many memories I could summon, no matter how many fatherly gestures I performed, my DNA wasn't his. Suddenly, my entire identity as a dad teetered on the brink. Caroline said nothing at first. She turned pale, eyes wide with something I can only describe as terror. In the hallway, our son was playing with the nurse's stethoscope, oblivious. She eventually mumbled something about mistakes in the test, but she must have felt my stare. One part of me wanted to lash out, to break that sterile quiet with a savage roar. Another part recognized that any outburst, any dramatic confrontation right there, would damage the boy, who was sick and needed calm. So I forced myself into a shell of composure I had never worn before. We left the hospital with an unspoken verdict. Something was irreparably broken. She tried to talk to me that evening, in half-lit corners of our living room. A single lamp cast a dim glow, turning everything a sorrowful shade of yellowed brown. I heard her voice from behind the sofa, a trembling hush. "It's complicated. Please, She trailed off. I turned and walked away. I heard her steps behind me, but I stepped into the bedroom and locked the door, ignoring the faint knocks. If I opened it right then, I knew we'd end up screaming, or worse, dissolving into some apology that wouldn't hold water. I needed to absorb the shock alone. My child was in the next room, curled up with a blanket. Even then, a primal part of me wanted to reassure him. He wasn't at fault. He was just a kid. None of this was his doing. Yet everything inside me blazed with anger. At her, at Mark. Though I had no proof he was the father, I still suspected. And even at the silent walls of our house, I felt like punching the mirror, but I didn't want to risk our son hearing the crash. Instead, I just stared at my reflection and let out a low, mirthless chuckle, a kind of black humor creeping in. "Damn," I muttered to myself. "All these years, and I was so certain." That laugh rattled around my ribs, hollow and painful. Part of me realized that my entire family life was built on quicksand. Another part found it ironically hilarious that I, a diligent father, conscientious provider, was apparently the biggest fool in my own household. Days blurred. The tension in the house formed thick, choking clouds. We spoke minimally, existing around each other like ghosts. I insisted on going to work. Numbers and spreadsheets were my refuge. I needed that normality, that routine. But even at the office, every ring of the phone made my heart slam. I dreaded hearing her voice, dreaded that half-whispered confession that might break me. In the rare moments we exchanged words, it was short and clipped. "He needs more medicine. The fever's down. I'll pick him up." Fine. That was it. We never broached the subject of the DNA test or the fatherhood in question, not while the boy was awake. Eventually, I confronted her in the quiet hush of our bedroom, about a week after the results. It wasn't so much a confrontation as a statement. We stood near the window. Outside was a dying sunset that stained the sky a dull purplish blue. I remember the color well because it tinted her hair in an almost violet hue. She turned toward me, and I felt the tension coil in her shoulders. I asked, "Is it Mark?" She looked away, biting her lip. There was a trembling in her arms that told me everything I needed. She didn't speak, but her silence said enough. Not long after, I discovered she had stolen my poems. This was, in a warped way, the final straw. Caroline had been so proud of that poetry collection, my little love letters, she called them. She self-published a small volume. For a while, I believed she'd found a creative spark, something to give her life meaning and color. But on a particularly restless night, I took that slim book from the shelf in her study and flipped through the pages. To my astonishment, I recognized lines from an old friend's journal, recognized phrases from my university professor's reading list, and then saw entire stanzas ripped nearly verbatim from my own attempts at verse back in college. She had pieced them together and claimed them as hers. It was beyond betrayal. It was petty theft of the intangible. She had stolen not just my fatherhood, but my words, my inner voice. The next morning, while she was out, I gathered every last copy of her book from the house, stacked them on the charcoal grill in the backyard, doused them with lighter fluid, and struck a match. For a moment, I watched the edges curl, turning black, and then a sudden burst of flame devoured the pages. The smell of ink and paper, acrid and bitter, filled my nostrils. I didn't feel triumph. I felt hollow, as though I'd just watched a piece of my life go up in smoke. She pulled into the driveway just as the final embers winked out. She saw the smoldering ashes and froze. I glanced at her face. No tears, just a wide-eyed shock and a silent parting of her lips. I said nothing. She said nothing. We both knew the meaning. The end of illusions. From that point on, I moved through life like a shell of my former self. I wasn't even sure what I was staying for. Love had twisted into something unrecognizable, or maybe it had been rotten all along. My paternal instincts were in tatters, though I still cooked dinner for our boy, helped him with homework. No matter what, he was still my son in every way that mattered. Except, of course, in blood. Caroline and I maintained a facade in front of him. Our interactions were slow, deliberate. She tried to speak to me about 100 times. She would stand in the hallway, swirling a glass of water, or linger by the couch, waiting for me to sit next to her. But I passed by without acknowledging her. I guess she realized that words wouldn't fix it, so she stopped trying. And then, ironically, she stopped singing. No more humming in the morning. No more whispered tunes at night. The house became a place of suffocating silence, even the child picking up on it, glancing nervously between us. He must have wondered why we'd gone from laughter to near-mute tension in a matter of weeks. But whenever he asked if I was okay, I'd muster a smile and ruffle his hair. "I'm fine, buddy. Just tired." A small lie, the kind we tell children to preserve some bubble of innocence. I might have walked away entirely. I considered it. God knows I did. My mind would drift to that possibility, imagining a small apartment near the downtown area, living alone, forging a new identity. But I had to know what I was losing or saving. I had to confront Mark. He was easy enough to track down. I knew from overheard conversations that he worked in marketing. I found out his address, discovered that he lived in a trendy high-rise apartment near the Chicago River. His place was sterile-looking, all glass and steel. I went there late one evening. The city lights glowed a sickly orange in the sky. I remember the uncomfortable tightness in my chest as I pressed the buzzer. He opened the door with a frown that quickly morphed into something akin to bravado. Of course, he recognized me at once. My face, no doubt, had haunted him, though in what capacity I couldn't guess. He let me in, said something about Caroline not being there. I just nodded, stepping into his living room without invitation. Everything was modern, minimalistic. I spotted a sleek laptop on a glass coffee table, a half-empty whiskey tumbler beside it. The room had a faint chemical scent, like disinfectant or maybe a synthetic air freshener. I took all this in with the strange detachment of a man drifting through a dream. We didn't speak much. It wasn't a conversation, so much as a silent standoff, with flickers of eye contact. He asked if I wanted a drink. I declined. I stared at him, trying to see what Caroline saw. Tall, confident stance, well-groomed hair, a faint smirk as if he'd already conquered the next 10 moves in this chess game. Then I asked about my wife, about the child. His expression tightened. He tried to sidestep, claiming he didn't know the full story. That it just happened, that life tosses you these unexpected connections. I found myself letting out another of those dark, humorless laughs, a mirthless exhalation that ended in a smirk of my own. He asked me if I wanted to hit him or do something stupid. "I get it, man," he said with a shrug. "But be logical. It doesn't have to end in violence." He was right in a sense. I didn't want to bruise my knuckles on his face. The damage was already done, and I'd only be adding a small footnote to an already colossal betrayal. So I turned to leave. At the doorway, he told me he was sorry. I glanced over my shoulder, and a wave of disgust, mingled with resignation, washed through me. I said nothing, just walked away, my footsteps echoing in the sterile corridor. When I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized I felt strangely numb. All that anger, all that heartbreak, had coalesced into an odd emptiness. If it had been anyone else, maybe I'd have unleashed a torrent of emotion. But I'd already spent so much energy containing my fury and sorrow. By now, I had nothing left to give. Back home, the tension grew into a silent war zone. Caroline was still reeling from the burning of her stolen poetry and the knowledge that I knew everything. Our child's health had improved, but we now had to navigate the awkwardness of more appointments. The pediatrician, apparently oblivious to the emotional fallout, insisted on further tests just in case, with every new form, every new line that said "father's medical history." I had to forcibly bury the pain. Because legally, on paper, I was still a father. But biologically, I wasn't. Every time Caroline tried to speak, I'd hold up a hand or just walk away. Not to be cruel, but because I had no idea what to say back. "Why did you do this? Why me? Why him?" The questions were endless, but I somehow knew that no answer would satisfy the hole in my chest. At night, sleep became a struggle. I'd lie awake, replaying the small clues I'd missed over the years. A phone call at the wrong time, an odd text on her screen, a sudden shift in her singing habits, a slip of the tongue about meeting an old friend. Was I blind, or did I willfully ignore all those signs? The mind can be willfully dense when it wants to protect a comfortable lie. Those nights, I found a twisted form of comedic relief in imagining Mark's hair gel spontaneously catching fire during one of his fancy marketing presentations, or his meticulously ironed shirt being ruined by coffee. A fleeting black humor daydream that kept me from screaming. Because sometimes, in the darkest moments, laughter is the only shield left. Then came the day I confronted Caroline in a more direct way. A final confrontation, if you will. We were in the garage of all places, rummaging for old boxes. I needed a hammer, and she was sorting through Christmas decorations. The overhead bulb was dim, a pale yellow that cast her face in sallow tones. She turned to me with that expression, caught somewhere between guilt and exhaustion. We ended up facing each other, the dusty boxes stacked precariously around us. She tried to say she was sorry. She tried to weep, but her tears seemed forced or absent. I told her to spare me the show. In a quiet, raw tone, I told her I knew about the poems, the stolen lines, and more importantly, I knew about Mark, the affair, the child's paternity. "Why didn't you just leave me earlier?" I asked, my voice dead calm. Why hum that damn tune in the bus, in front of me, right next to him? Why torture me? Her lips trembled. She mumbled that she never wanted to hurt me, that she thought I understood her frustrations, that she felt caged. "You never listened to me," she insisted, ironically. "And he, Mark, he made me feel alive. He saw me." I wanted to retort, to spit that I did see her, that I'd loved her. But all that came out was an exhale. My silence was more damning than any shouted insult could have been. She stood there for a moment, tears in her eyes. I waited to see if she'd find the words that might fix something, anything. But we both knew there was no fix. So eventually, she just turned away, rummaging in a box for something invisible. I caught her reflection in the dusty metal of our old bicycles. She looked hollow. Part of me pitied her. Another part felt an icy wave of anger, overshadowed only by a deeper wave of indifference. And that was when it truly struck me. The worst part wasn't the affair or the lies. It was the apathy that had taken root in both of us. The rotting silence that now permeated the air. She had cheated, yes. But in my mind I thought, maybe she's just as empty inside. Maybe that emptiness was what drove her to search for something else. Maybe I was also to blame, in some cosmic sense. But it didn't matter anymore. A few more weeks passed, each day bleeding into the next. On some evenings, I'd watch her move through the kitchen, half expecting to hear her start humming again. Some ephemeral tune that used to bring warmth to my mornings. But no melody ever came. She drifted around the house like a stranger, or perhaps I was the stranger. Then the day arrived when I enacted what I believed to be my final form of retribution. Not a vicious or violent act, but something that felt strangely more potent. I went into her study, rummaged through the drawers until I found all her drafted poems, all her half-finished lines. She hadn't published them yet. She probably planned to edit them. Maybe she wanted to pick out new stolen phrases to patch them into a coherent piece of work. I pulled each page out, reading a line or two. Some were obviously lifted from old notebooks I'd once shared with her, back when I was knave enough to show my private scrawls. Others were bits from famous authors she might have admired. With each stolen phrase, I felt my pulse quicken, a hot flush creeping up my neck. I gathered them. She walked in just as I was about to leave the room. We locked eyes, and I could see the shock, the realization. She asked me something in a faint voice, maybe, "What are you doing?" or "Why?" I don't remember the exact words. My mind was set. I carried those pages out to the garage, tossed them into a metal bin, and set them ablaze without ceremony. She stood a few feet behind me, arms hugging herself. The fire flickered, painting the concrete walls in dancing orange and blue. I stared at the flames, the way they devoured lines that had once been my private confessions, as if finally purging a part of my youth that she'd so casually hijacked. The smoke made my eyes water, but I refused to turn away. When the last page curled into ash, I dropped the lighter and walked inside. I didn't hear her follow me. What came next felt like the final stage of a dying marriage. I consulted a lawyer discreetly, not to finalize anything right away, but to understand my rights, especially regarding our child. He was innocent, and my heart still ached to protect him. Legally, he was mine, if I pursued it that way. The lawyer explained complexities. I could fight for custody or partial custody, depending on how everything unraveled. But it was a labyrinth of forms, potential disputes, the possibility of genetic disclaimers. Meanwhile, Mark was still on the periphery, though I had no illusions. He and Caroline were continuing something. Yet ironically, I suspected their relationship was already soured by the way of consequences. From the glimpses I got, her phone ringing late, abrupt tension in her eyes. Perhaps she and Mark had begun to realize that fantasies can crumble under real life. But I no longer found any real satisfaction in that knowledge. One night, I thought about leaving the house for good. I even packed a small suitcase. But as I stood at the front door, I heard my son's voice behind me. He was calling for me, saying he couldn't sleep, that he had nightmares. I set the suitcase down, forced a gentle smile, and guided him back to bed. Afterward, I just stood in the hallway, staring at his closed door, listening to his slow, steady breathing. The bag remained by the front door, untouched, as though mocking my indecision. I told myself, tomorrow maybe. But tomorrow came, and I stayed. Caroline approached me in the living room a few days later, looking gaunt. I was sitting in my favorite armchair, a worn-out old thing that had seen better days. She hovered in the doorway, hands clasped together, a posture reminiscent of a guilty child about to confess a misdeed. I didn't invite her to sit, but she walked over, resting on the edge of the couch. In halting words, she admitted that Mark wanted more from her, that he was pressuring her to leave me fully. She stared at me, perhaps hoping for a reaction, a jealous rage, or a desperate plea. I remained silent, letting her words hang in the stale air. She continued, voice trembling, about how she didn't know what she wanted anymore, how she felt torn between guilt and longing. I looked at her, my expression flat. Inside, I expected anger to blaze. Instead, I felt a coldness, a sense that we'd come to a place beyond heartbreak. She'd shattered me. I'd burned her illusions, and all that remained was the husk of what we once called a marriage. After a lengthy pause, I said quietly, "Do whatever you want. I'm done." She left the room. I don't know if she cried. I heard a door close softly somewhere in the house, maybe a bedroom door. The hush that followed felt heavier than anything I'd experienced before. Days spilled into weeks. We lived in the same house but occupied different worlds. At times, she disappeared for hours, presumably to see him. I turned my energy toward my son, making sure he got to school on time, doing chores, paying bills. My routine was all that kept me from spiraling. At work, I excelled at being a quiet, methodical advisor. I found solace in numbers, in the predictability of spreadsheets and calculations. My colleagues began to notice my changed demeanor. Some asked if I was all right. I'd fake a small chuckle, telling them I was just dealing with some family stuff. Occasionally, that black humor poked through my thoughts. I'd imagine Mark's reflection in some giant marketing award ceremony, brandishing a silly grin, while I wrote mental notes on all the ways his glib charm would eventually fail him. Or I'd picture Caroline trying to publish more stolen poems, only for an editor to catch on, leading to public humiliation. These imaginary scenarios gave me a perverse kind of amusement, though it never lasted long. Because the truth was still painfully raw. My marriage was a corpse, and I was sharing a house with a woman who'd erased everything I believed in. The child, he was too young to fully grasp it all. He sensed the tension, though, and withdrew into himself. He started getting quieter at dinner, playing with his food, eyes darting between me and Caroline. That guilt alone might have been enough to push me to do something final, like divorce. But I was paralyzed by the knowledge that no matter how we ended, he'd pay a price. Eventually, though, a single confrontation took place late at night. She came home smelling faintly of wine and stale perfume, a swirl of city lights dancing in her eyes. I was in the hallway, having just put the child to bed. She set her purse down, looked at me with a mixture of shame and defiance. Then, out of nowhere, she tried to kiss me. I reeled back in shock, an immediate wave of revulsion hitting me. "No," I muttered, my voice low. She stood there, blinking as if slapped, tears threatening to spill. "Why?" she asked, almost breathless. "Why do you hate me so much?" I exhaled, a short, bitter laugh escaping. "I don't hate you," I said quietly. "I feel nothing." And in that moment I realized that was the worst condemnation I could ever give her. Hate would imply some passion. Indifference meant the well of feeling had finally run dry. She broke down then, or tried to. Sobs racked her shoulders, but I wondered if it was regret for what she'd done, or regret for how far she'd fallen. I just watched, arms folded. A sliver of me wanted to comfort her out of sheer habit, but that part was overshadowed by months of betrayal. So I turned and walked away, leaving her trembling in the darkened hallway. Time, they say, can dull the sharpest pain. But in my case, it simply created a new normal. The house remained silent. She stopped singing altogether, not a single hum or note. I kept waking up each morning, going through the motions. The morning coffee lost its warmth. The walls seemed narrower, the colors muted. Blue, yellow, dim. Everything felt off-tone, like a film shot with poor lighting. One morning, I woke to find a packed suitcase by the door. hers this time. She was in the kitchen, sipping coffee from a mug, staring into space. I stood behind her, half expecting a dramatic farewell. But she didn't even turn around. A faint reflection in the microwave door showed her eyes were red-rimmed, her expression vacant. Finally, she murmured, "I can't stay here like this." No apology, no blame, just a statement, as if acknowledging that we had reduced each other to ghosts. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Where's he?" I asked, my tone devoid of emotion. She swallowed. "He's waiting for me, I guess." Another short, quiet laugh from my chest. It felt almost comedic, the final step in a tragic play. "Good luck, then," I said, my words tasting like ash. She didn't move, still looking at the drips of coffee in her mug. "And our son," she said, voice trembling. I inhaled slowly. "He stays with me." She closed her eyes. A silence stretched out. Maybe she weighed her options, fight or leave. Eventually, she just gave a tiny nod. "He's still your child in every way that matters," she whispered, her voice thick with sorrow. "He loves you." "Then don't take him from me," I said softly. She gave me a look that contained remnants of the woman I once knew. Guilt, sadness, maybe a shred of decency. "No, I won't. I'm not that cruel." I nodded, heart pounding with a strange relief. Then I stepped aside. She gathered her purse and the suitcase, heading for the door. I expected a final word or glance. There was none. The door clicked shut, leaving me alone in the hushed yellow morning light. The emptiness felt both suffocating and freeing. But this isn't quite the end. Not yet. Because a few days later, Mark showed up on our doorstep, presumably to gather Caroline's remaining things. I recognized that arrogant tilt of the head the moment I opened the door. He stepped inside without waiting for me to invite him. My jaw tightened. He started to say something about Caroline asked me to pick up, but I raised a hand to stop him. I told him curtly to wait in the living room, that I'd bring her stuff. My chest was tight, a swirl of conflicting urges. Part of me wanted to swing at him, but it felt pointless. Part of me wanted to say something scathing, but I was so damn tired of it all. While he waited, I gathered a couple of boxes with her clothes, some folders of her notes. God knows what might be stolen lines in there as well, and her personal things from the bathroom. It took me about 10 minutes. I carried them to him, stacking them by the door. He looked at me with that same smugness, though tempered now by caution. "Look," he said, "I know this is. Just take it." I cut him off. "Leave." He hesitated, then picked up the boxes. Before he stepped out, he turned to me, eyes flicking with a hint of remorse. "If it makes any difference." "I'm sorry," he murmured. "Doesn't," I answered, opening the door. He left. I locked up behind him. This time, I felt a cold finality. That chapter was over. In the weeks that followed, I focused on my son. We settled into a routine. School, homework, dinner. I told him that Mommy had gone to stay somewhere else for a while. I was careful not to paint her as a villain. She might have wronged me, but he was too young to digest that. I wanted to preserve at least some measure of peace for him. Lawyers got involved eventually. Papers were filed. The official dissolution of our marriage began. She didn't contest custody. I suspect the guilt weighed on her heavily. Sometimes on lonely nights, I sat at the edge of my son's bed, watching him breathe, thinking, none of this is his fault. The knowledge that I wasn't his biological father was overshadowed by the bond I felt. He was my son in the ways that mattered. I clung to that fiercely. I also realized something important. The worst part of betrayal is not the affair itself, but the indifference that follows. The slow fade of care, the hollow space where love used to be. The knowledge that we'd spent years weaving a life together, only to see it unravel in a matter of months, was devastating. Yet, ironically, that devastation turned into a numb acceptance. One afternoon, months later, I wandered into the old bedroom, the one Caroline and I once shared. The sun's rays cut a diagonal swath across the floor, turning the dust motes into tiny flecks of gold. Her side of the closet was empty. The air smelled stale, like memories that had gone musty. I looked at myself in the mirror. The lines on my face seemed deeper, the hair around my temples streaked with more gray than before. I thought about the man who'd once sat in this room, listening to her hum, believing it was the sound of love. And I pitied that younger version of me. Pitied him for not knowing that sometimes the biggest betrayals start with the smallest, softest songs. Still, I was alive. And I felt, if not hopeful, then at least determined to keep going. A dark humor rose in me as I realized I had survived the worst. My life was scorched earth, but sometimes new things grow out of the ashes. She never returned to singing. At least I never heard her hum again. Word reached me through mutual acquaintances that she moved in with Mark, tried to cohabit in some fancy new development. Possibly they were planning to get married, but I doubted it would bring her the freedom or happiness she craved. I felt no joy in that thought, only mild cynicism. As for me, I wouldn't say I was healing fast, but I was healing in my own slow way. Every morning, I woke up to fix breakfast for my son. I taught him how to fish again that summer, a short trip to a nearby lake. He reeled in a tiny perch, eyes shining with excitement. I gave him a congratulatory clap on the back, and in that moment, I felt a surge of raw emotion that nearly brought tears to my eyes. Whether or not we shared the same DNA, that boy was the piece of me that truly mattered. When we got back home, I entered the kitchen and paused. My reflection in the window looked strangely calm. The old sense of dread was gone, replaced by a quiet acceptance. The hush of the house felt different now. No longer suffocating or ominous, but a comfortable silence. I realized I had become used to it, even relied on it. I once read that sometimes the best revenge is simply living well. Maybe that's true. I might never forget what she did, or how it felt to be betrayed by the person I trusted most. But I have no intention of letting that define me any longer. I am, for better or worse, still here, still breathing, still alive. And in the mornings, when I pour my coffee, I no longer strain my ears for the sound of her soft singing. There's only the soft chirp of birds outside and the steady beat of my own heart. Life goes on, even when love doesn't. She called once, months later. I answered with a measured tone. She asked how our son was doing. I kept my response polite, matter of fact. He's fine. Doing better at school, had a good time at baseball practice. She said she wanted to see him sometime, that she missed him. I said we could arrange something, but it would have to be on my terms. She hesitated, then quietly agreed. I hung up and felt nothing. Maybe a mild sense of pity again. Perhaps she realized that Mark wasn't the solution to her emptiness. Or maybe she was truly trying to be a mother, at least part-time. Whatever the motivation, I was done expecting heartbreak from her. Her power to hurt me was gone. In the final measure of things, I learned something essential. People can endure more betrayal than they think, but real devastation occurs when the heart goes silent. When you stop feeling anything, not just love or hate, but every gradient in between. That's the scariest moment, realizing that indifference has taken hold. I'm not proud of what my marriage became, or how I handled certain moments. Could I have been more attentive, more open, so she didn't wander? Maybe, but I'll never know. The only certainty is that I survived. I'm not the same man I was. I'm older, a bit more haunted, but also free from the illusions that once comforted me. My child still calls me Dad, and I'll stand by him, no matter what. Let the lawyers fuss about bloodlines. Let the neighbors whisper. Nothing changes the bond we have. In that sense, I won a battle she never even realized was taking place. Do I miss her sometimes? Maybe a faint memory of how she smelled in the morning, or how her laugh used to fill the room. But then I recall the hush after the bus ride, the slow unraveling, the scorching truth of that DNA test, the stolen poems, the final turning away. and that memory is enough to keep me grounded in reality. I live now with a quiet acceptance, a calm in my routine. I cook dinners. I watch old movies with my son. I sometimes crack a wry joke to myself about how my life turned out. My nights are filled with hush, but it's a hush of my choosing. A kind of peace. And she no longer sings. Maybe she can't. Maybe that quiet is her punishment, or maybe her voice was never meant for me in the first place. Either way, in the morning, I greet the silence like an old friend, because it reminds me I'm alive, beyond her betrayal, and strong enough to face another day. So if you ask me how I am, if you ask me what it's like to pick up the pieces after betrayal, I can only tell you, it's like stepping into a cold, clear morning after a stormy night. The ground is littered with fallen branches, but the sky is open. And you realize you made it. You outlasted the worst. I stand in that quiet dawn, coffee cup in hand, remembering the hush that used to hurt me. Now it sustains me. And in that hush, I find my voice again, no longer drowned out by her false lullabies. The only sound is my own slow breathing, and it's enough.